Hey everyone, this is Rich Mogull, Chief Analyst with the Cloud Security Alliance, and I'm joined today with Aaron Turner, a frequent collaborator of mine over at IANS. Aaron and I are both actually IANS faculty members. So Aaron, you want to give your title and background and then we can jump right into it?
So I'm wearing the IANS faculty banner today, sharing some of the lessons that we've learned from some hard mistakes that people have made in multi-AI systems, and as well as some good wins that we've seen from people within the IANS ecosystem about, how do you connect these complex things together in a way that you can actually get secure work done?
Yeah, and the origins of what we're about to cover in the next 30 minutes is Aaron and I spent a lot of time in 2025 traveling around together at some of these IANS forums. And basically, we were in the speaker ready room. That makes it sound exciting. It was just like a bad conference room at a hotel, and talking about these issues and how we were dealing with it ourselves. And so that led us into like, man, we got to like put this into a presentation. Like, let's get this content out there. And so here we are. And to set the context of what we're going to talk about, what do we mean by multi AI? We're focused on the enterprise architecture side of using AI. So you'll see that in a moment with the slide. We've got the next slide coming up, but this isn't your personal desktop agents so much as it is how do you deal with the issues of building in agentic AI into your enterprise architectures, particularly when you're going to have multiple agents, multiple MCP servers, and multiple applications and environments.
And one thing that I'll reiterate here is that our mantra is if you've got agents running with unconstrained user context on an endpoint, that's a bad day. Like there's not much we can do to help you. And so what we're coaching a lot of IANS clients to do is to say, look, treat agents like malware. Use your EDRs to find and constrain those things to let them run inside of designed environments. Same thing holds true for MCP servers. You should not let people run an MCP server on their MacBook. Like that's not okay. Like that MCP server now gains the entire user context of that user. So treat them as malware, crush them, force them into places where you can run them with proper controls.
Yeah, this is all very enterprise focused. And you guys know a lot of our research here at the agentic control plane work that we're doing here at CSA. And a lot of the member conversations I'm having, as well as the IANS conversations around, they're all kind of hovering around these areas, which is why we wanted to put together an architecture, which actually Aaron put together. But what is that going to cover? And so when we're looking at these, let's just do a little bit of quick level setting. I mean, at this point, if you're here, you know what we're talking about is, you've got your front end application, could be check, could be something else, connecting into an app server. And then behind that is sitting your LLM. And that could be using RAG to pull up data. It could be connected with MCP servers, which are the arms for, to allow that LLM brain to actually go out and do things.
And one thing to keep in mind is sometimes you'll have meta architectures, right? So for example, you've got a chat that goes to this LLM that then spawns an agent that then connects to another MCP server that then connects to another data set. So these can exist in multiple layers. We've seen the biggest one I've seen so far is a 15 tiered agent to MCP workflow, right? It's like layer across layer across layer. And there was legit business reason why they wanted to do that, but that has a lot of complexity you've got to account for.
Oh, even the tool I'm building for CSA Enterprise members, hopefully it's done by the time you guys see this, or mostly done. I think I've got about 8 to 10 agents already defined in that thing. And just because each of those focusing on a different task, focusing on doing, something else. And why are we talking about this from a risk perspective? Clearly, we think this is big enablers. I mean, Aaron and I are both building tons of tools using these things. But, as he said, realistically, that what happens when you're using agents and MCP servers is you're giving AI models access to your internal tooling and access into your internal environment. And if you have problems like lack of data classification or lack of different of internal security boundaries and everything else, it can lead to all sorts of potential negative outcomes associated with that.
And if you think about what we've sucked at for the last 30 years, we have sucked at identity and we have sucked at data classification. And so essentially, we're paying right now for 3 decades of not doing well at the control planes that we need for this.
So here's some real world examples of this from, these are all, ripped out of the headlines. I'll go through super quickly, but, the first one is like ServiceNow. It had the Now Assist agent that was subject to indirect prompt injection. Somebody could take a ticket They could basically embed their prompt into that ticket, submit it, the agent would read it, and that agent had broader permissions. So going to what Aaron just said about overly broad IAM, it's not what we're good at. So the agent itself had more permissions than the user sending the ticket into the agent. And then the user would send a command, and that command was read as part of that ticket, and boom, led to data exfiltration.
Another way that we've seen this happen in the ServiceNow ecosystem is where someone has submitted a ticket to say, hey, can you tell me all of the people who have had their laptops confiscated for child sexual abuse materials? And now that person knows all the investigations that are going on that they shouldn't have access to because ServiceNow knows who has their laptops confiscated. And so it's not just a matter of data exfiltration. Sometimes it's an individual being exposed to data that they should have no right to. So the lack of segmentation.
Another example, very similar pattern, was GitHub. So GitHub, in this case, it was an MCP server compromise. So it was an MCP server that was basically the way to read GitHub issues and do some automated handling of that. So the developer, hey, MCP server, read open issues. Well, those issues had hidden instructions in them. That MCP server then now is basically, it's now being used to compromise that particular agent. That AI is working within the permissions and the context of that user. And it was used to exfiltrate private repositories.
And so if you think about situations where there's no good control for MCP server deployment, that increases the risk of an MCP server that then has these types of capabilities. In one organization, I saw a guy who had set up a CI/CD pipeline just to deploy MCP servers to bypass the Wiz controls that he wanted to be constrained by. And so thinking about, people who are just trying to get work done, they're like, oh, I just need to get all this stuff done. And then their effort to just get stuff done, they're essentially defeating the security boundaries to help you do stuff.
So what's the big picture of the architecture? I'm going to just intro it and then turn over to Aaron because he actually wrote this, although I made the pretty picture because he sent me a really blurry one the first time through. Uh, and so there's key layers here. Client side, when you're making that connection in, the perimeter security, because again, we're talking about enterprise architecture. So it's not just running on your local desktop. You're going to have load balancers, API gateways, and then after you get past those, you're getting inside into the hosted platform, and there's an observability layer. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk through all of these, and we're going to basically look at different facets of what the trust boundaries are. Because the more security and trust boundaries, and the more you understand what rules and what kind of boundaries you can enforce where, that's really the core of this architecture that Aaron designed.
So first, thanks, Rich, for giving me that. We talked about this a lot, but I mean, and thanks for up leveling my low resolution graphic that was created by, I won't say which AI created it
It
for
was the
me.
most important part.
And so one of the things that I think is a huge thing to remember here is that, lean on what you've got, right? Don't feel like you have to start from scratch here, right? You'll notice old school terms here like TLS and API gateways and, things that we have hopefully in place. So make sure that you're leveraging the stuff that you've got.
And so the first thing we need to do is have oops, sorry, color got a little off. We missed it when we were pulling over the template, but is infrastructure matters. So, we've got friends who work at professionally as pen testers, and many of them tell me, yeah, they don't have to worry about prompt injection because they just hack into the infrastructure and they have access to everything anyway. So there's different layers of infrastructure to keep in mind as you're building this. The first is your compute network storage, the raw infrastructure where you're running these things on. Vuln management, hardening, patching, those all still matter. Then you can leverage your cloud accounts and segmentation because bluntly, most of these are being built in cloud. Amazon, Azure, Google, that's where the vast majority, at least the projects that I've been involved with that involve agentic AI are being built for enterprise architectures. And so having different levels of isolation. For example, the member empowerment platform thing I'm building, that is dedicated into its own development and its own production accounts, and other CSA things that we're doing that are also agentic are running in different accounts. It gives us that segregation. If they need to communicate, we then can communicate using things like APIs. But you also have, where's your AI workload running? Are you using containers? Are you running it in a platform? That all the major cloud providers have their own local platforms to do that. And then the top level is how then can you put in your AI guardrails and controls, which we're going to detail that a little bit more as we get into it.
One of your best allies to get this done is the chief financial officer. Collaborate with your finance team to understand what is the scope within which you are executing these AI things. Because every time you go build a new AI thing, a new platform, it's cost. And so use cost constraints to drive simplicity and a centralized control plane.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're almost daily trying to figure out how can I reduce my token use for as I'm building these and optimize different models, different locations, those things. So Zarin said identity is the heart of dealing with this. If you look at both of those breaches that we mentioned in the ServiceNow case, it was because the agent had more privileges than the user and was able to do things. And there was no, as we're going to mention over and over, on behalf of kind of access patterns. And then in the other case of GitHub, the MCP server was operating within the full context of that user. And but the user wasn't actually looking and sending all those prompts themselves. Quite a bit of that was kind of automated coming through there. There's a lot of aspects of like the different connections internally of the trust boundaries that you saw in those architectures.
If I think back to my career, I joined Microsoft in 1998 when we were inventing Active Directory. And it was on the journey when we had to go from old school NTLM credentials to Kerberos, right? Why did we need Kerberos back then? Well, because we wanted Kerberos tickets to have full traceability of a user with its final destination relative to data. The same thing holds true now. Unfortunately, Kerberos doesn't work in this environment. We have to use OAuth. And so don't let someone say, oh, OAuth is too new, I can't do it. I've had several conversations with consulting clients where people are saying, oh, I don't have anyone who knows OAuth. And I'm like, well, use a large language model to learn OAuth, right? Go and teach yourself how to get that done faster, because OAuth is table stakes here. It is the only identity protocol that has the ability to be multi-scoped and multi-jumped so that you can hold someone accountable as they work through the entirety of the system.
We also need to manage the autonomy of the agents. So I'll give you an example from Amazon. If you use Agent Core Guardrail or Agent Core Gateway, you can actually go ahead and write CEDAR policies that will say the tool's only allowed to do these things and access these resources. And it's a way of constraining the bad behavior, potential bad behavior of these agents so that it's not able to abuse its IAM permissions and do a privilege escalation. I guess maybe it could, but even if it did, it still wouldn't be able to access more than what those deterministic walls around it gave it access to do.
If we look at the Claude code leak that happened a couple of weeks ago, what did we learn from Anthropic? Why was Claude so much more performant than its competitors? Well, we saw that Anthropic was using simple regex statements for guardrails, right? Use simple regex statements for guardrails. Help yourself to avoid problems. Now, when you're doing more complex things, like for example, at IONS, we've got this platform called Ask IONS, and Jake Williams, another one of our collaborators on these ideas, he helped design that. And what we learned working with Jake is that sometimes if you want a lower or a higher deterministic output and decrease the potential for randomness, you actually chain three different models together. So the non-determinism of three different models actually helps drive determinism. It's weird, but it's not what mathematically it should work that way, but in practice we see that each model sort of helps keep itself within the bounds. So whether it's simple regex or complex multi-models, there are ways to manage autonomy.
Yeah, my understanding is like in many cases use a combination of both. So you use like a basic regex to find, when keywords or whatever, which would then trigger the model, but you still also have the model do it, or the other agent doing its non-deterministic eval. I know some clients that use different models to actually get different perspectives, different frontier model providers. So you might mix, Anthropic and OpenAI and Gemini to pull it together. So where can you enforce these boundaries? Aaron Tara, OAuth is, I mean, that's the main one you need to be working with now. That's where, in our belief, it's been around for a while, but it's also, that's where we see the developments to support a lot of this agentic. There's even some new extensions to OAuth coming out. So when you have your client that is connecting, it can transmit its OAuth token. And that, again, you're still outside. Remember, this is the user connecting into the system. And so you have the user context that you're defining at that boundary layer. Then you get into the perimeter section and you can validate that at load balancers or the API gateways on that user side. But again, you're still not at the agent yet. You're enforcing that the user has access to get into those parts of the system. Then when you actually get into the model portion of it, that's where you can actually assign an identity to the agent, and you can do a blended identity. We call it an OBO pattern, on behalf of pattern. So now the agent, you know who the agent is, and it's all in the same token. If your grant's the right word, yeah. It scope grant. I always get my OAuth terms. Yeah, the scope of OAuth has here's the user ID, here's the agent ID, and so you can build your identity decisions around that.
If you think about this chart here, the hardest parts become making sure that you keep that identity, that on behalf of identity, consistent even to the final hop. So for example, you've got an MCP server, and let's say someone has fronted that in front of some crazy old Oracle server, right? There's an old Oracle database. Oracle, that, whatever old version was, doesn't support OAuth. Well, what I may do is maybe I use a good old Nginx firewall in front of that and terminate an OAuth token in front of the Oracle server. So I at least have the ability to trace to where that identity went in front of the Oracle server. So don't be afraid to add additional layers to your ecosystem so that you can have traceability throughout the entirety of it.
Yeah, and I do want to emphasize one of the mistakes you can make that I've seen, and not as much with AI because this is new enough, but in other patterns is people will take that full identity scope, the user and the agent, and then they'll basically turn it off as it crosses a security boundary. And so, as Aaron just said, you've got to carry the full context. So the entire chain of the identities that was involved, you can carry those past those security boundaries. But if you terminate it and then you're like, oh, well, I don't need the user scope now, I'll switch to the agent scope. Now it's operating at the full scope of that agent, and you're going to lose that context. And privilege escalation is a very common outcome of that.
So if we think about data access in this model, really an MCP server is not just an API gateway. It is a just-in-time policy-driven data disclosure engine. Case in point, I saw an instance where an MCP server was set up and it was pulling data from two different data sets that under regulatory compliance, that those two data sets should never be combined. So for example, one was a customer list, and one was a supplier list, and the organization didn't want those two things put together. They shouldn't have been put together. And so the things, by driving an identity to the last degree of data, you should be able to basically say, no, I'm not okay with this token sharing these two data sets, and I'm going to kill it at the MCP server. I'm not going to let those things wander off to the data to potentially create what I call toxic data sets, which are where MCP combines diverse data in ways where it becomes toxic even holding it. So treat MCP as a zero trust context broker, enforce least level privilege where you can, and prevent downstream disclosure through output aware controls that drive towards that context of, I've got this user context. Do I really want that user to combine this data in these ways?
Yeah, and it's not just MCP, the RAG aspects of this. Like I have a Bedrock knowledge base right now that I'm building out that's going to hold a bunch of stuff, and it's easy for me to keep things isolated in different paths in S3. But by default, that knowledge base would lump it all together.
Now, we've already talked about validating results, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide for the sake of time, but let's make sure that we do think about guardrails, right? These AI agents interacting with a gateway, looking at a policy engine, having model execution nodes, response sanitization and verification, and then make sure that you've got appropriate logging throughout all of this. Because if you can't look at the logs of the prompts and the responses, you're not in a great situation to try to enforce this.
Yeah, I call this the guardrail sandwich. On the way in, the guardrails are looking for any attempts to do bad things. And on the way out, it's validating that the response is an appropriate response and isn't exposing data it shouldn't expose. And remember, the guardrails can do all sorts of cool deterministic stuff around the outside. Like, hey, let's use a regex to look at all the sensitive data in the response and make sure an outside query validates that that is data that that user is supposed to have.
So if we think about this goal-based access on behalf of scope, access is granted based upon what the intent is, not the identity alone. So you're looking at, what is this thing trying to do? Like, is it trying to interact with something that is just a read activity? Great. oh, wait a second, this identity is trying to spawn an activity that becomes read and write, or read and change, or read and execute. Maybe I'm not okay with that, right? So make sure that you drive into your designs and working with your developers to say, make sure that you've got the ability to filter based upon intent of what it's trying to do in the interactions.
So, in terms of these action and scope boundaries, where do you enforce these? The gateways coming in is a great place to do it. You can actually check the scopes before those requests are actually going into the agent and the models. And then we can enforce that at the MCP server as well. So, there's a few different places, but typically the guardrail sandwich around. And again, once you look at the guardrail frameworks, I haven't looked at our full agenda for the event, but I think you'll probably see other presentations kind of covering those pieces of it. That really makes sure that any input and any output going to an agent, that's what we're talking about with the guardrail sandwich, and that's where you can enforce these.
Thinking through the data that's coming out, making sure that you're using the tools you've got, whether that's the hyperscaler DLP, whether you want to do token level filtering, aught or shard labs, making sure that you've got periodic response trend analysis of what's coming through here. These are going to be elements of how you're looking to manage this over time.
An important one that we actually didn't mention here too, that I had come up with a organization I was talking to a CSA member, is also monitoring for drift. And your output monitoring can actually be important because one of the things you're going to find is depending on how you've architected and run these, because the data keeps changing that the agent's going to see over time, it may actually start drifting from your initial intention in terms of the results it's replying, and that's another reason that output filtering is so important.
And so wherever you're at, do what you can. In Azure, you've got Entry Workloads and Sentinel. AWS, you've got AAM roles and STS tags. GCP, Workforce Identity Federation. So always focus on who was the AI acting for, and then go about using the controls you've got in your desired platform.
And log everything going in and everything coming out. And particularly if you're in a regulated environment, we know that, OCC level and some of the other financial services regulatory bodies, like you have to keep that information because you have to have that explainability of why that occurred, just like you have to track which people touch things.
I came up with this question. Do we need a prompt layer firewall? Like, think about the old, stateful firewalls we had before. Then we had application layer firewalls, and now we've got, all the different kinds of firewalls going on. Well, make sure that you use content inspection at every hop you can to look for, whether that's AWS Comprehend, Azure Content Moderator, GCP DLP, use those things to look for things like prompt templates and type systems to make sure you've got consistency through the entire process.
And so, as with our other layers, you've got your filtering. So you can filter the data coming in, you can filter your process responses at any of the MCP tool levels. You can also do your filtering and your analysis on the data at that point as well. And then this is even outside of like your pre-existing data security controls that you might have in place. If you've got some of the, I mean, it's not as common database activity monitoring, those kinds of things. There's nothing to prevent those tools from still being part of these architectures.
Bring it all together. Be cynical of anyone who says they've got a silver bullet for this. Like anyone who's like, hey, yeah, we do the whole thing. It's like, yeah, I bet you do. I mean, that's a great venture capital pitch that you got there. I don't want to have to be the first customer for your silver bullet thingy. So make sure that you use the tools you have. Don't expect any vendor to come in and solve this for you. You've got to have discipline, just like any hard cybersecurity problem. This takes discipline. You've got to work at this, and you've got to drive it as a thought model that you're going to inject into your developers, into your infrastructure operators, into your support staff. Drive this throughout the organization.
Yeah, and the default is not always to do that, and it's not hard. Like, with the when I'm using Claude myself to do development, I have written in as part of my prompt, my system prompt, Claude MD, that the security assessor is always going to be looking at things, and that I actually put in specific architectural constraints, so that even though it's coding and helping design, and I'm doing this all with infrastructure as code, that it knows I've chose my system. In my case, it's because I know Aaron's a big, very familiar with Microsoft. I'm very familiar with AWS, and I'm like, I'm using Bedrock. I'm going to use the guardrails. I'm using Agent Core. I'm using Agent Core Gateway, and it's all of that's being built out as we go along.
So, like Rich just said, use the tools to cover what we skipped. Right? We didn't talk a ton about threat modeling here. We didn't talk about model assessment, looking at the MCP code, and the stupid human tricks. So use the trick that Rich just shared of like, hey, coach your developers to put as part of the filters that are interacting with these things, hey, this is what we want as outcome, right? We want something that's security provable. We want it to fit within our security policies.
And there's even more you can do. Like you can mandate the prompts for your organization, the default system prompts and stuff that, and the Claude MD files. You can insert, embed your security in those as go out, but that's a whole different talk that we didn't get into. So one of the things I want to emphasize is that we took very much an architectural approach to this because the technologies are changing incredibly quickly. The models, the capabilities, the different frameworks, those are all going to change. We do believe that we've tried to focus on consistencies. I don't see OAuth going away. We don't see guardrails going away. And I don't see the architectural patterns we presented here going away.
Yep. Focus on what is consistent over time. And we didn't even bring up all of the cool stuff you can do with Spiffy Inspire, right? So there's ways that you can use TLS level connectivity to actually layer on top of OAuth. And so the thing that I will say is that, because of time, we didn't have the ability to go into the nth level of detail. But what's great is you can engage with Rich and I through CSA, through IANS, whatever is the easiest way for you to work with us. We've got additional content that we're happy to share.
And we've got a whole bunch of stuff we're pushing out the door on both sides on all of this stuff, including occasionally stuff that Aaron and I work on together. So, where do you start? Start by identifying your key projects. You just have to know where these are. A lot of these are almost a little bit out of your hands if you're on the security side, because we do know things are moving very quickly. And within the first few months, you should understand those projects and what security boundaries are available. And really, the more you can like lock down on a framework, the better you're going to be in terms of both your identity management and your guardrails, because that gives us some level of consistency.
I'll just say, focus on where you're at, right? Don't have unrealistic expectations to try to up level the entire program at once. This is the only way to succeed here is with iteration. Use the tools that you have. Don't expect a silver bullet from vendors. Start with the basics and stick there. So I'd just like to say thanks to CSA for inviting us to do this presentation. Rich, always a pleasure to collaborate with you. Hopefully people can walk away with this and say, I've got something that I can do today where I'm at.
Yeah, and like Aaron said, if you've got any questions, you know where to find us, and enjoy the rest of the event.